bit of Total War Warhammer 2 quick match gameplay. This time around we are on Galbaraz, playing as the Beastmen against the forces of Norsca, and as you can see, we got the pigs, we got the Razor Gores, the Baconators. Look at these cute little piggies, just look at them, so sweet and beautiful. We'll bring them to the field, and we're really going to see how Wilbur does against all these Norskins. So this is a matchup that people kind of say is a bit skewed against Beastmen. I don't personally agree, but especially with Fimir, the Beastmen do sometimes struggle a little bit. But what I really wanted to do here was test out the Razor Gores and see if I could make them work, because I quite frankly, this was inspired a little bit by a forum debate about whether or not the Razor Gore is in need of a buff or not, and it's ongoing. Personally, I think it is. I think the Razor Gores are underpowered, but that's quite frankly because of what I've seen. When I see other people bring them, very rarely, it's basically always a disaster. The Razor Gores flunk, they get destroyed, and they're essentially a waste of gold. But I figured, you know what, let's try them out. Maybe them missing something. These guys do have Rampage, which is terrible, but they do have, you know, they do have some Splash. They do have okay weapon strength, and it's AP. Their charge bonus is respectable. Their HP is not terrible. They only cost 600 gold. They do cost Fear. So I figured, you know, there might be some niche for them. Maybe we can make them work. So this is a bit of a double cast. This first one is against Norsca. So we're trying out the Baconators. For the rest of the composition, it's very light on the middle here. The middle is just 3 chevroned up Ungor Spears, basically just to hold the line, backed up by Blackhorn's Ravagers. Basically, this is just a holding force. These guys are not amazing, doing much of anything. They're just there to buy me some time. They're backed by Morgr Shadowgave, who of course does have all his summons. Once again, a very stalling, effective lord. Brave Shaman of Shadows, though, providing some proper magical support, bringing Melkoth's Miasma, bringing Penumbral Pendulum, Enfeebling Foe, and of course the Jagged Dagger and Smoke and Mirrors to the field. So lots of buffs and debuffs there, and as well as damage. And of course he is able to run roughshod over his opponents with the help of this lovely pig chariot. So of course the heroic chariots are actually pretty effective. And I find them to be really useful for just running through infantry, and I figured here he'll probably do pretty well. 2 Ungor Raiders are there to provide some suppressive fire against enemy skirmishers, and out on the periphery is really where the killing power is. So 2 Razor Gore, it's basically a mirror comp. There's Razor Gores on either end, we've got Centaurs, because I don't think you need that much AP, and if you're dealing with Skin Wolves, I think it's better to just mob them rather than trying to bring AP against a unit that doesn't have much armor to begin with. You just want a little armor to deal with Fimir, or a little armor piercing to deal with Fimir and champions and mammoths and that sort of stuff. Some Poison Warhounds for the debuff, Centaurs the great weapons. The other flank is a little more heavy duty because we do have the Sons of Goros as well as another unit of Centaurs, but otherwise is basically the same thing. Now my opponent, he did Vanguard deploy some Marauder Horsemen and Horsemasters into the corners, but his main line is all over here, and it's actually 6 units of Berserkers, so very heavy on the Berserkers. They are backed by Wulfric, and my opponent actually cut some corners here on Wulfric. The only thing Wulfric's got is Seafang. He actually doesn't even have Hunter of Champions, which is a little surprising, but perhaps my opponent figured that Wulfric wouldn't be that great at actually catching lords on his mammoth. I do think its Hunter of Champions is still good because it lets your other units kill lords pretty effectively, but regardless, he doesn't have it. A Shaman Sorcerer of Fire who does only have Burning Head and Firestorm, which is not a spell you see often, but we'll see if it gets much use here. Now Berserkers, although I personally think the lack of AP here is a bit of a problem, against my comp, which doesn't have much armor to begin with, it could actually perform rather well, and you can see the Berserkers here lining up. My opponent spreading his forces out, trying to cover all flanks, trying to make sure I can't hit him from an unexpected angle. And he does see that I've got a stronger contingent on either flank, so he is committing a much heavier force to the flanks rather than to the middle, where, you know, the Marauder Berserkers, they cleave through this chaff, just the 2 of them and Wulfric. There are Skin Wolves on either end to provide some anti-large, and there are several units of Norscan Warhounds to provide some additional sort of support in combat. I do think a slight mistake here is not bringing any Fimir, because I think they are definitely a pretty good unit in this matchup. Regardless, you can see the match is kicking off pretty quickly. I actually shuffled my entire mobile force over from the right flank, or from my right flank, and now you can see we're getting our first counter charges. The Centaurs over here just countercharging the Hounds. I don't want the Sons of Goros wasting their charge bonus on some silly units like Norscan Warhounds, because I want them engaging the Wolves. And you can see the Wolves here ruined a charge, hit with an Enfeebling Foe, which is going to debuff them a whole bunch. And these guys don't have the greatest charge bonus, so as they get collapsed into by the Sons of Goros and by the dogs, by the Chaos Warhounds, they're going to be suddenly in a terrible spot. You can see they're just getting melted. In come the pigs, and let's watch if the Baconators get any value here. You can see this guy's just jumping in here. The Hound just pushes in, and poor guy, look at him, he's getting staggered by dogs. He's getting gored, and down he goes. The pig can impale him there on his tusk. In the meantime, here in the back line, you can see the Shaman is in here. One of the cool things about the Shaman is, of course, that he has respectable, if not amazing, armor. And so he's going to be able to kind of deal with these Marauder Berserkers. We're getting all these great charges in with our Centaurs. And these routes are immediately turning into shatters because there's so much damage going down. Sons of Goros only took 1 model loss and annihilated that unit of Skin Wolves. these Norscan Warhounds gone, and these Berserkers are completely out of position, ready to be surrounded by a horde of very angry, very brutal Beastmen troops. And I still have these troops in reserve that I've just not been on top of my micro. I just haven't had enough speed to deal with it. Now, unfortunately, the main fight is going badly. The Ungor Raiders are trying to whittle down the Skin Wolves and push them off, and we actually succeed, which is good. But my opponent is able to sort of push up off my infantry. Wolfric is going to be able to break into the cookie jar here, get into our Ungor Raiders. And so despite our best efforts, the Skin Wolves are going to rout, and of course, they're going to be able to recover some of their HP. Over here, the Chaos Spawn are trying to cleave through the Norscan Warhounds, doing rather well, of course, because Norscan Warhounds are a terrible unit against something that does so much weapon strength. That has so much weapon strength, and a splash and all that sort of stuff. So these hounds are just going to rout and flee. Elsewhere, though, you can see Berserkers are chewing their way through this infantry. They are definitely much better than Blackhorn Ravagers. They're much less than Ungor Raiders, who are not fit for fighting that. But you can see the Firestorm just not doing much. It kind of wanders off. It's not good against cavalry. And over here, the Shaman Sorcerer Fire got caught, hit by an enfeebling foe, and killed. So my opponent is without magic now, and we're collapsing on these pockets. You can see these Berserkers shattered. These Berserkers over here routed by Centaurs and Razorgors, just collapsing from all sides. And of course, with their very low armor, these guys just cannot hold up, and they're getting shredded. And you can see, look at the pigs here, just scoring them to death, just jumping in there. Of course, they don't have very good melee defense either, which once again helps the pigs who don't have very good offensive stats outside of their charge. Now, in the meantime, this pocket is finally the last bastion of resistance. The Berserkers rampaging and breaking immediately. We do have the Brave Shaman of Shadows cycle charging in and out, doing immense amounts of work. And Morger, obviously, he doesn't have the greatest melee defense. He is potentially, if the Berserkers got a nice, good surround on him, they could probably tear him down pretty quickly. But as it is, with the Centaurs in there, with the Hounds in there debuffing the Berserkers, we are able to whittle them down. And my opponent is definitely not in the greatest spots. We're able to zone him away here with Ungor Spears. Over here, the Hounds getting chipped away at by the Chaos Warhound, or by the Marauder Horsemasters. But big mistake on my opponent's part. He should have just turned around and piled into these guys and routed them off the field. But this way, he's wasting his time over here. And in the meantime, in the pits, we are going to get another Chaos Spawn summon. Wolfric's surrounded, and my opponent is actually just going to GG out at this point. So this match, I don't think it necessarily demonstrated the Razorgors to be particularly good or bad. It was just a steamroller, and this is one of the things you have to be very wary of against Beastmen. Don't separate your force. If your force starts getting isolated, that is when the Beastmen really shine. They have a huge mobility edge against practically every faction. Really, you could argue they've got a mobility edge against literally every faction. Only Wood Elves, I think, can give them a run for their money. Maybe High Elves with the Lyrian Reavers to a very small extent. But otherwise, they're basically uncontested in the mobility department. They are the most mobile faction in the game, and there's no way to dispute that, essentially. And my opponent's problem there was that he had different blocks of troops on different flanks. Essentially, my entire right flank shifted to the left, so all of my troops were on one end. They crushed his troops over there, and in the meantime, his right flank couldn't shift over to the left flank fast enough. And even if he was able to juggle a few of those troops over there, it wouldn't have been enough to stem the tide. So that was a huge issue for my opponent. I don't think this is necessarily the most competitive build, and I'll be blunt about that. I do think if you're going for more competitive, you should bring some Marauder Champions. You should bring, I think, a Fimir caster. I'm not a big fan of the normal Shaman casters, but that's largely because I like Arcane Conduit, and because I like the Fimir actually able to apply additional armor sundering. I do think Fimir Warriors would be better here, and I don't think Wolfric is particularly good in this matchup. I think you're better off bringing Throg. For shooting, I think Marauder Horsemen are adequate, and you can just use them to harass, but you don't want to bring too much shooting because it'll get zoned off, and Beastmen have some pretty good shutdown tools. This many Norscan Warhounds definitely way too excessive. You definitely don't need that. And the Skin Wolves I don't think are particularly great. So I think this is a bit of a motley build. But nonetheless, I do think the Razorgors here perform well, and I do think if you're looking for a competitive build as Beastmen, this is respectable. Because the Centaurs, they give you such a huge mobility edge, you collapse the point of your opponent's army. Apologies there. And you collapse the point on your opponent's line, and then you snowball it into a greater victory. And you saw how fast those routes turn into shatters, simply because the Beastmen can apply so much pressure so effectively. They've got so much speed, you can't escape them. But without further ado, we're going to hop on to another match in our replays here, where we're going to look at some additional gameplay. So this time it's going to be against Dwarves, and it's going to be on the map Cairn Woods. Now my opponent here going with a bit of an oddball build. I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best of builds. I went with a more conventional build, I think, than I normally try to do against Dwarves. Against Dwarves I try weird stuff like Cygors or Mass Centaurs, but I decided to go with something a little more conventional here. 2 Harpies to shut down Gyrocopters or to zone them away, to shut down artillery, that sort of stuff. We've got the Regiment of Renowned Minotaurs, the Butchers of Kalkengard, 4 Bestigors, 3 Ungors to disrupt backlines and harass Slayers and units like that. A Bray Shaman of So we've actually got units hidden all the way out over here, so the Ungor and all that units. But we've got a Brave Shaman of Shadows with Enfeebling Foe as well as the Withering. I personally, just because Rune Lords can essentially negate a huge chunk of magic damage, I don't really think it's actually worthwhile to bring magic damage. That's against Dwarves, in my opinion. I know some people still do it, and they'll say bring Fate of Unit, it still does a lot of damage, but I just don't think it's as efficient as buffs and debuffs. That's my 2 cents. So he's on a Chariot. Kazrak's also on a Chariot here with the Scourge as well as Apocalyptic Vision. Surprisingly, no, I just didn't have the money for Dark Mail. It's such a good spell in this match. It's such a good ability in this matchup. Just kidding. No, it's freaking terrible. But either way, the Chariots, of course, can do a lot of work to the Dawi. Frontline Bestigors. Ungors immediately pushing forward. And we're just going to push in. There's not really much to say. Our Razorgors, I did deploy them in the woods, but they don't have stock or the hidden in woods trait, so they're not going to be able to hide, but we want to shield them from artillery. We don't want them to rampage, which is a big risk against Dwarves. Now, I put a bit of an oddball build. He deployed his Slayers. He brought Giant Slayers, which I think is a bit of a mistake, and he has a lot of great weapons. You don't need this much AP against the Beastmen. You need a wider line to defend all your shooting. My opponent doesn't really have the width here, but he did bring some Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. He's got some hammers. He's got some Dwarf Warriors, some Gyros with Brimstone guns, Organ guns, and a cannon, or 2 cannons, and some Iron Drakes, as well as those Giant Slayers. So very narrow and very sort of shooting heavy build, which I don't think is ideal against Beastmen, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most competitive, but nonetheless, we'll see how they perform here. But you can see Thorgrim is, of course, in there with his big Book of Grudges. With actually, he doesn't. Never mind, I lied. He doesn't have the. Does he? No, he doesn't. He doesn't have the Book of Grudges, but he's got Stand Your Ground. He's got Oath of Vengeance and Foe Seeker. So Thorgrim, of course, a very good Anchor Lord, very solid at just resisting damage and dishing it out in return. But I'm simply going to collapse here on my opponent's troops. You can see the Ungor herd pushing in. My opponent here, these are Gyrocopters with Brimstone guns, so they're not particularly good against mass units like the Ungor Raiders. Now, unfortunately, you can see the Giant Slayers, you get a huge charge, just wreck these Ungor Raiders. But suddenly my opponent's army is getting collapsed very quickly. You can see the Butchers of Kalkengard jumping in against the Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. Over here, Kazrak and the Brave Shaman work incredibly well against the Dwarf Warriors, and you can see they're just tearing them to shreds. And although here, on the flank, we're swinging around our Piggies, we're swinging around our Ungors, and in come the Harpies. So they're coming into the shutdown. Over here, the Harpies are chasing off the Brimstone guns. Now, Brimstone guns are actually fast enough to outrun these guys. And had my opponent had better defensive tools, he probably could have just shot down the Harpies. But as it is, he can't. You can see the Gyrocopters getting shut down, getting harassed, and taking some nasty damage from the Harpies. Over here in the pits, in the meantime, you can see just debuff after you have hammering these guys. Dwarf Warriors getting terror routed. The hammers hit with an overcast and enfeebling foe, and of course Kazrak is in there. So despite the debuffs from Oath of Vengeance, he's just doing so much damage, melting these guys. He's got Scourge going, and the hammers are getting slaughtered. It's not even a contest. These guys are just melting, and they rout immediately. So very quick match, very quick shock and awe. In the meantime, the Piggies here jumping in on the Iron Drakes, who are basically an ideal target for them. They've got armor, which is irrelevant against the AP. They've got very low melee defense. You can see they're getting torn apart pretty quickly by the Razorgors. They're definitely doing a pretty good job of that, because my opponent simply doesn't have the tools to defend them. The Giant Slayers, who was really his only hope there, are actually getting dragged from the muck by a single unit of Bestigors and some Ungors. So a very cost-effective trade here. It's why I don't think Giant Slayers are good in this matchup. 2, why you got to be wary about where you put your Slayers and want to bring some cheaper troops to deal with the cheap enemy troops. But you can see at this point the snowball is real. Dwarves, of course, on their short little feet can't outrun anybody, much less Beastmen. And the rout is real. And you can see the Razorgors here actually performed rather well at wiping out these Iron Drakes. I think almost gained a chevron there. So it did some good work. Thorgrim surrounded, getting beaten down by the Butchers. We probably would have an enfeebling foe pretty shortly, but my opponent's army at this point is just going to shatter to army losses, and he is going to hop out of the game. So some pretty brutal stuff, some pretty straightforward Dawi smashing, and the Beastmen take the day. So, 2 games with the Razorgore, and the Razorgore does okay. It could do some damage against Iron Drakes. You know, it's a little difficult to get the matchups you want or the situations you want. It is worth noting that in a situation like this one against Dwarves, if you bring Centigors, normal Centigors, they cannot do very much damage to the Iron Drakes. Those Iron Drakes, well, certainly my opponent's placement there was bad. Those Iron Drakes can't really be hurt by Centigors. Even normal, I think, Thunders and units like that are going to be pretty immune to Centigors. Their melee defense is respectable enough, their armor is there, and they're going to be tying you down and wasting your time, and you're not going to be able to rout them quickly. I think the Razorgors were actually able to sort of dish out the hurt they needed to these Iron Drakes, and I think they could do the same thing to, say, Thunderers or Quarrelers. Much better than, say, Unit Centaurs. Now, I'm not entirely sure they're still useful for that, because you're paying 600, and for just a little bit more gold, you can get normal Centaurs. And for, if I wanted to, I could have gotten some Centaurs with great weapons, which is obviously more expensive than the Razor Gore. But, you know, we could drop a Harpy and for these 2 Razor Gores and get 2 Centaurs with great weapons, which is potentially a better investment for the Beastmen. It does give you some more greater flexibility. It means you won't rampage. My opponent's placement here was just not very good, but if you're able to avoid that rampage, if you're able to just get them into a sweet spot, they certainly do well. But I think against a dwarf box, they do a lot worse. I'm not really sure. I want to say this is kind of inclusive. You could definitely make them work. I definitely wouldn't say it dissuade you from trying them out. I definitely think the Razor Gores are not as terrible as I at first thought. They can do some damage. They can be a bit of a nuisance, especially against units that are weak against them, that have low melee defense, that they can splash, use their splash attacks on. But I don't think they're particularly amazing. So, but they can work. For the rest of this build, if you're looking for building against Dawi, this is, I think, a respectable anti-Dawi build. You've got some backline shutdown, you've got something to deal with gyros, which are otherwise really hard to deal with, because throwing axes struggle to hit them. If your opponent's at all on top of his micro, you're almost never going to hit them. And the other option is, well, you got throwing axes and you got Ongor Raiders, which are not going to cut the mustard either. So I think the Harpies are just better. And yeah, it works. I think Kazrak's also, I know some people say bash Kazrak as being a terrible lord, but honestly in his chariot, he's a pretty respectable combatant, and I definitely think he's well worth it. For my opponent's army, like I said, go wider. You don't need giant slayers, just bring normal slayers. Dump the Iron Drakes, dump this much artillery. You don't need this much artillery. Just bring a cannon or 2, and then bring some Quarrelers or Rangers or Thunderers or something. But don't go with this sort of shooting build. Go wider. You don't need Hammerers. You can bring Longbeards with great weapons, who will do a much better job, in my opinion. So that's my 2 cents on it. That's my opinion. But regardless, good game to my opponent here. Good game to both of my opponents. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it a bit informative and perhaps gave you some ideas on builds and whether or not the Razor Gore is any good. If you have any comments, any criticism, as usual, guys, don't hesitate to post them down below, and I'll do my best to respond as soon as I can. As usual, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.